Hello there! Welcome to Scanning Key Productions. I'm Crown Grays Cocon. Let's get into the video. Today's video we're asking the question of, is Brexit to blame? Now, the long answer to this is yes. Right, that's the end of the video now, right? I've still got quite a bit to go. So it's true, Brexit is to blame. Brexit is the reason why your dad never came back after just popping out to get that pint of milk. Brexit is the reason why your girlfriend left you for your younger brother because he said that he's more mature than you. Brexit is the reason why when you go to the restaurant sometimes there's a bit of a shortage for food, and you don't get exactly what you want. And Brexit is also the reason why last month you end up having to queue up for petrol. Okay, those last two, I mean, those other things might have happened in your life as well. If so, sorry. The last two, they did have something to do with Brexit, right? And so this video is going to explain a little bit about this. People are like, oh, for God's sake, still talking about Brexit. The thing is, the reason I'm still talking about Brexit is because whenever something happens in this country that's bad, people go, oh, it's because of Brexit, right? So this video, we're going to give a bit of a historical context to it, right? Because as with all things, right, history is the debate between different facts and stuff, right? Some people might say alternative facts, whatever. But the point is that it's all about kind of looking at history and having different debates, right? So just for myself personally, growing up, as I've said in previous videos and stuff, growing up I always kind of was instinctively kind of Eurosceptic. And then at the time when they actually had the referendum and stuff, for before that and like a few years afterwards, I was like very firmly for remaining in the EU, right? However, when I started looking more into the history of things, especially the history of like Britain, like just before it joined the EU, the history of the EU itself, which a lot of younger people don't tend to know about, right? That's when I became a proper like a Eurosceptic, because by looking at history, you go, okay, right, this is actually what's kind of happened and stuff, right? And there's probably a reason why, as we discussed in previous videos, so there was two referendums, one in 75 and one in 2016. And, the people who voted in the first one, who were alive for both, the people who voted in the first one, who voted 2/3 to stay in the EEC at that time, those same people in 2016 voted by 2/3 to leave the EU. So something must have happened in those 41 years to cause such a kind of like massive shift between one perspective and the next. So, by looking at that and looking at the debates there, you go, oh, okay, right. But it's not just enough to look at like the history of the last 40, 50, whatever years, right? We need to look a little bit further back, right? So what we're going to do is going to go all the way back to this Doriga slide of around 8,000 years ago, as this was a massive tsunami which was caused by a landslide which happened out in Norway, and this caused a huge tsunami which like flooded much of what's today Britain and wiped out what like people today call Doggerland. So basically across like the whole of like the North Sea and like the English Channel, there used to be a land bridge, so like Britain was connected with the continent, so it wasn't an island at that point, so people lived there, etc, etc. So all that got completely wiped out and stuff. And actually, if that tsunami had never happened and if Doggerland still existed, there probably would have never been a Brexit, because Britain wouldn't have had this island mentality and it would have just been another part of the continent and there would have been no debate. Okay, I could have done an alternative history on that. However, that's way, way too broad and it's just too many kind of things, right? So we're going to bring it back a little bit, not to 1975, but to 1775. And we're going to be looking at American independence and having a bit of analysis with that. And then later on, we're going to look at Irish independence and, in all three cases, look at American independence, Irish independence, and then Brexit and compare the three. But before going into all that, I need to answer the thing first and foremost about all the petrol queues and etc, and the truck shortages that we had more recently. So yes, Brexit is to blame for that, and Brexit will be to blame for many other things that go wrong the next few years. However, it's kind of like, if someone dies of lung cancer, just blaming it on lung cancer, and it's like, okay, but you're not going to factor in the 50 cigarettes that the dude smoked every single day of his life, right? There's a deeper kind of thing to that, right? So, immigration wasn't the number one thing why people voted to leave. It was actually number two. But immigration did play a massive part in this, especially with regard to the more recent shortages of truck drivers. So this country has had an over-reliance on cheap migrant migrant labour, right, which has depressed wages. You know, if, even the Bank of England, you know, their studies have looked into this, because obviously it's supply and demand. If you have an oversupply of people, then you end up having a decrease in the demand for domestic wages, right? You know, so rather than training up local people to go and do these jobs, many of these jobs over time have come to be seen as immigrant jobs. And actually, I've got a personal story with this, right? So I was, you know, I obviously went to university and stuff, right? But during those years and a little bit afterwards, I worked as a cleaner. And I always remember, yeah, there was one time when I was working at a bingo place, and some dude who clearly had a Canadian accent started talking to me in Spanish, right? He was like, hola, ¿cómo está? And I was like, bien, and he started just continually talking to me in Spanish. I was like, well, my Spanish is not that good. And he was like, wait, what? What? Wait, hold on, you're from England? That's my attempt at a Canadian accent. But he was like, you're from England? And I was like, yeah, dude. And he's like, what are you doing cleaning? I'm like, I'm working here. Like, what's the question? So the problem is that, you know, we have too many people who come here who are highly skilled. You know, I've known cleaners who are you know, have degrees in economics, who have masters in this or that, etc., etc. You know, and they're coming here and they're cleaning. And there's other people who are picking fruit, and there's other people who are serving your coffee, right? And the problem is that many people who are highly skilled are coming here, and we're getting them to do menial jobs, which are very low skilled or unskilled, right? On the flip side, we've got millions of people who are unemployed, who are looking for jobs, who might have like a low IQ, etc., etc., but there's not really an encouragement to, you know, long term get them back into work and get them. So I'm not saying that immigrants are taking their jobs, but the thing is, from a business perspective, you go, right, okay, I don't have to train these, don't really have to look after these immigrants, because I can pay them low wages, they're hardworking, like they're smart, like they'll just get on with it and stuff, yeah. Meanwhile, I've constantly got to keep like telling like this other person like kind of what to do all the time, etc., etc. So from a business perspective, yes, I do understand it. At the same time, the majority of people in this country, whether it's right or wrong, yeah, if you believe in democracy, the majority of people in this country want there to be less migration. So if that's the case, that means that you're going to have to train local people to do these so-called immigrant jobs. Right, so now that we've got all that about like the more recent like Brexit-y kind of things out of the way and stuff, right? Now we can focus on history and giving like a wide perspective on things, because as with always, you know, you need to give a wide perspective on things, because history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme, as the saying goes, right? It does kind of, you can see similar patterns, right? So we're going to fast forward, like I said, back to 1775, right? So in 1775, you know, so you got the American colonies, you got 13 colonies there, and you know, you obviously got Britain and stuff. And Britain, you know, from a few like years from before, had just fought the 7 Years' War against the French. So they kicked the French out of Canada. So the American colonists, yeah, they were now secured from the threat of the French invading them. So it wasn't unreasonable from the eyes of the British Parliament to be like, right, okay, these colonists benefited a lot from our efforts in this war and stuff, right? People in England obviously paying like taxes to pay for this, right? Well, okay, we're not going to charge the colonists the same amount as we would in England, but we're going to charge them a little bit, just to kind of, you know, just to raise a bit of revenue and stuff, and that way, like, we can, you know, help them and like they can help us, right? So that was the idea. However, the way that Americans responded to this was, well, with the Boston Tea Party, right, in 1773. So that was obviously, that was a huge like revolt and stuff to do with having taxes, yeah, because the thing is, it wasn't about the taxes, it was about, as they said, no taxation without representation. So what you have to understand about the American colonies is that obviously most of the people from these colonies had come from Britain, right? And societies tend to be a kind of a time capsule in many ways to about like the society that they came from, right? So England in those days, you know, was very focused on liberty. Like, you know, people there were obsessed with liberty. If only people were still like that now. But anyway, so anyway, they were really obsessed with this idea of liberty and stuff, of, you know, life, liberty, and property, right? And so for the American colonists, yeah, they had the idea of, you know, no taxation representation. So whereas in Britain, obviously you didn't have universal suffrage in those days, yeah, but you did have parliamentary representation, right? So your local MP represented your interests and stuff, or at least was in theory supposed to and stuff, right? So in the same way that, like, yeah, okay, children, for instance, in our present day, they can't vote, but they're still represented by their local MP. So that means that, like, you know, people in Britain at least have some semblance of representation, right? And the problem is that for the Americans, their colonies had no representation in the British Parliament. And so they were annoyed not about the taxes themselves, but they were annoyed at the fact that the British Parliament was imposing taxes on them, which they in America had zero say on it. There wasn't one US colonist who could have any say on what the taxes ought to be imposed on them, right? So that's what was the kind of the spark for this, right? But as with all independence cases, there's not like anytime a country wants to get independent, it's a messy thing, right? So people at the beginning, yes, obviously you've got some radicals who are like, we should just secede, right? But most people for a very long time are very much like, okay, we just want a bit more autonomy, we want a bit more respect, etc., etc. So this is kind of what the American colonists were doing, right? And so, for instance, the most misquoted quote in American history, has got to be, the British are coming, the British are coming. Because they never would have said the British are coming, right? What they actually said was the regulars are coming, right? So the British regulars, like, the soldiers are coming. Because this was when the rebels obviously are starting to, rise up and stuff, right? And the British regular troops are coming to crush it, right? So in 1775, this is when you had the battles at Lexington and Concord, and this is when so-called shots fired around the world occur, right? So this is the British troops firing on American colonists, right? And this really starts to heat things up. This is what's seen as the beginning of the American Revolution or the American War of Independence, right? So what ends up happening is that the next year you end up having Thomas Paine, as we discussed in previous videos. He writes the pamphlet Common Sense, and this is to this day the most popular pamphlet sold in America. Sold absolutely millions and stuff. And what this was arguing for was basically this idea, or first of all, it was arguing against the necessity of a monarchy and stuff, but it was arguing for independence. And the main thing that he was arguing, and bear in mind, Thomas Paine was an Englishman, he was born an Englishman, right? But he was saying, how can a continent be governed by an island thousands of miles away? This doesn't make any sense yet, right? And a continent ought to govern itself in the same way an island ought to govern itself, right? And so that was the argument that was made, right? And so, fast forward a few months now, because that was that pamphlet came out in, I believe, January of 1776. So by July, that's when you having the Declaration of Independence, by Thomas Jefferson, etc., etc. So this begins the road to a long bloody war, right? Which it effectively was ended by 1781, but really it didn't fully officially end until 1783. So you had 8 years of warfare, right? That the new American Republic was born into, right? And in many ways, this wasn't just as with all kind of independence wars and stuff, right? It's not a simple thing of you're fighting against the kind of the foreign kind of colonizer, right? You're also fighting basically a civil war. Because within America, you had many people who were loyalists, right? Who were loyalists to the crown, who thought, this is a bad idea, right? And what you tend to find is that these loyalists tended to congregate in the major cities such as New York and stuff, right? Whereas the people who were basically the rebels, the ones who wanted independence, tended to congregate more within the countryside and within small towns around America, right? So these are the ones who wanted independence, and the loyalists are the ones who were opposed to independence, right? Now, after this, basically the Civil War, this war for independence and stuff, many loyalists did migrate to Canada. Many of them migrated to England and stuff, but many of them stayed where they were. And even some of the ones who went to Canada, some of them eventually came back and stuff, right? So for a long time afterwards, there was a lot of grumbling between people who were living within the new United States, right? And also, just something to kind of bear in mind is that when America, obviously, first of all, it fought this war against Britain, but, America at this time was heavily dependent on trade, both with Britain and with its empire, right? So in 1770, 57% of America's trade was done with Great Britain and what today is Northern Ireland, right? So this is not even including Ireland, it's not including Canada, it's not including the Caribbean, most of which was obviously owned by the British and stuff, right? So when you total up all of that, you're talking about roughly 90%, if not excess of 90% of Americans' exports going to the British Empire. And so if you're making the argument back in those days for, should the colonies get their independence, you'd be like, hold on, this is the mother country, we speak the same tongue. Literally, some of us were literally born there. Some of our either our parents or grandparents or people within living memory and stuff, came to this country from that country, right? So we're not going to, what are you talking about? Yeah, it doesn't make any economic sense here. And then on top of that, when they got their independence, right, like, as a result of Hamilton's policies, yeah, so Alexander Hamilton, of course, yeah, he's the one who sets up, like, most US tax revenue in those days, yeah, for the federal government came from tariffs, right? So tariffs obviously are taxes on imports. So if most of the trade is done with Britain and its empire, who are those tariffs mainly going to be affecting? Britain and its empire, right? So your largest trading partner, you're basically putting tariffs on them, right? And this led to a lot of tensions between Britain and America. On top of that, also you end up having eventually the War of 1812, which went on from 1812 to 1814. And in 1814, the British were so annoyed with America that they invaded Washington DC and burnt the White House down, right? So this kind of gives you a bit of an idea. This is almost like, so you're talking about almost 40 years after the Declaration of Independence, right? A lot of people, if you looked at them and basically was like, was it a good thing? A lot of people in these colonies would be like, yeah, see, I told you we should have stayed with Britain. Yeah, that kind of, yeah, it doesn't make any sense, right? And actually, if we look on in economic terms, right, we can see that America at that time, so Britain at that time had a GDP per capita of around $2,900. This is measured in 1990s dollars terms, whereas America had just $2,400, right? So Britain at the time was like better off than the American colonies, right? And actually, for a long time afterwards, you can see basically a kind of stagnant economic growth and stuff here, where the standard of living in America doesn't really increase over a period of 40 to 50 years after independence, right? So even 40 to 50 years afterwards, it's still not apparent whether independence actually made economic sense for the Americans. However, obviously, as we already know from like just world history and stuff, right? By 1880, America's standard of living surpasses that of Britain. And also around this time, this is when America, which had no colonies at this point, end up having a GDP which is larger than Britain, which had the largest empire the world has ever seen, right? So, talking almost 100 years after independence, this is when it suddenly makes sense. Like, oh, look, you see that they had a point, yeah, like kind of, so like this is where it clearly has shown that in the long run, it's made sense for us to have been independent from the British Empire, right? So it took a long, long time. And now, obviously, if we fast forward to the present day, no one's arguing that America should be like tied to Britain still, right? And people in hindsight can now look back at it and go, oh yeah, they did the smart thing. They were big brain when they got independence, right? Because America's standard of living today is far in excess of what Britain's is, right? So what the point I'm making with this is that when things happen in history, we have to look at things in a broad sense, yeah. And even a generation after something happens, yeah, right. Even 2 generations afterwards, it's not immediately apparent that the decision was a good one in the end. Right, so now we've looked at American independence, now we can fast forward a little bit and look at Irish independence, right? So obviously we've covered Irish history extensively on this channel. Check out our videos on like what if Ireland united, like both that one and the Q&A, and also the clip videos taken of that. Well, the clip videos, the same thing, whatever. But the point with that is that we've covered a lot of that. Although in one of the comments, yeah, someone was like, "Oh, you forgot to include about like what Cromwell did to Ireland." Yes, Cromwell killed many people in Ireland, but again, that was in the 17th century. So yes, it was kind of relevant. It's obviously relevant. It's one of the things that happened, but like there's a lot of things which happened over many hundreds of years of British rule in Ireland. But with all that being said, we fast forward now to the 19th century. So obviously you had the potato famine in 1845, but that was also the same year in which the Catholics got emancipation, right? So this is when Catholics in Britain and in Ireland got the right to vote, right? So this is something to really bear in mind, yeah, that the United Kingdom was the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, right? You can even see this in the Union flag today, yeah, right? You can see the cross of St. Patrick is there, right? And that's because Ireland was an integral part, not just of the British Empire, but of Britain itself, right? Within like, the UK itself, yeah, like it was an integral part. So I know a lot of Irish people get triggered if you say, no, we're not British, whatever. But the point is, yeah, right? If you look at it, Ireland played a huge part in Britain in like its domestic policy and also in its colonial policy, right? So a lot of Irish people kind of will try and pretend this didn't really happen and stuff, yeah. But Irish people, they played a big part like across the whole of the empire and stuff, right? And, they fought in the different wars, they colonized many of the different places, yeah. So they played a massive part in it. And yet Ireland in 1922 got its independence. Why did it get its independence? Well, again, as happened with the American colonies, right? It wasn't like an overnight thing. They didn't overnight just want independence, right? There was a big push for what was known as home rule. So home rule, that's what we would today call devolution, right? So the Irish basically wanted to have their own parliament in Dublin, where they would vote on like local issues and stuff, yeah, like, and like a handful of things here, right? Now, obviously, this was opposed by the unionists up in the north and stuff. That's a separate conversation which we covered before. Yeah, but the point is that up until what happened on the Easter Rising in 1916, there wasn't really a massive push for Ireland to be independent, right? And actually, when the Easter Rising happened, yes, this is obviously when like the kind of revolutionaries kind of like took over in Dublin and stuff, right? And like so, they took the post office there. So people in Ireland, the way they reacted to that was like, oh, what are these people doing? It's like, we're fighting a war, and we've got people like Irish people like fighting on like the Western Front and stuff, yeah, against the Germans and stuff, and fighting for king and country, yeah. What are they doing and stuff, yeah? Like, this is madness, right? However, how the British dealt with that, much in the same way as how they dealt with Lexington and Concord, because they came down in such a hard line way against the rebels here, yeah, right, because they lined them up against the wall and just executed them, right? This is what actually caused a lot of Irish people to like switch like their opinions, right? And this is when they started to become in favour of independence. So you can see this in the final election where United Kingdom and Ireland as a whole, where they had like an actual election and stuff, and this was in 1918, right? And you can see that overwhelmingly in what like later became the Republic of Ireland, and also like some places in the north, right, they were voting for Sinn Féin, right? So you can already see that like they are now clearly wanting independence, right? However, Irish independence, just like with American independence, is not as straightforward, right? So obviously, again, as happened in America, you had like major cities. So in America, it was obviously places like New York. However, in Ireland, Dublin, these places were strongholds of loyalism, right? So that's something we often forget, yeah, that many people in Dublin were like, we don't want to leave, right? Like, kind of, we're happy to be part of the British Empire and stuff, right? And many people across the island were like, no, we don't want to leave the British Empire. Like, we're an integral part. Like, we actually, unlike in like the American colonies, yeah, where they had no representation, in the case of Ireland, they had representation. 105 out of 707 MPs sat in the British Parliament were Irish, right? So now you kind of understand, like, kind of, oh, right, they have quite a strong argument for not wanting to leave, like the greatest empire that has ever existed, right? So what ended up happening is that you end up having a really bloody war for independence, and then in conclusion to it, yeah, they end up being the so-called like kind of Anglo-Irish treaty, and this basically split Northern Ireland from what would become the Irish Free State, right? So within like the Free State, there was a division between the people who were pro-treaty and people who were anti-treaty, right? If you watch the film Michael Collins, it's really, really good. Highly recommend it. It's got Liam Neeson and it's got Alan Rickman in it, and yeah, so definitely check that film out. We'll cover that at some point as well. It's really, really good. But within like that film there, you can see some of the tensions between the people who are pro-treaty and the people who are anti-treaty. And this ends up leading to the Irish Civil War, right? So the pro-treaty IRA eventually end up crushing the anti-treaty IRA. However, in the meantime, the anti-treaty IRA, so the ones who like fully like, no, we don't want to like peace deal with Britain and stuff, and we don't want to have King George still as the head of state. So basically these people are Irish Republicans, and they want a united Ireland, and they don't want like King George, or they don't want to be part of the British Empire at all, right? So these are the people who like end up making things very uncomfortable for the residing loyalists who are living in the south, right? And many of these people, as we discussed in our previous video, end up fleeing to Northern Ireland and to Britain itself, right? So very messy kind of thing, very messy situation. And then also on top of that, between 1932 and 1938, the Irish end up doing a trade war with the British, right? So they end up raising tariffs on the British. And this is at a time when, don't forget, that Ireland, almost 90% of its exports went to Great Britain, right? So again, it's a kind of very similar thing to what you see with what ended up becoming the United States. It's a thing where it's like, hold on, overwhelmingly the amount of trade that you're doing is with like your former like kind of colonial masters, yeah. However, you're now putting trade barriers between you and them. Like what the hell? So for many people in Ireland, yeah, long time after they had independence, there was almost no economic growth and stuff, right? And it's like, so what was really the point? Yeah, like kind of like, so for many people living in Ireland, years and years after independence, they were like, why did we do this again? Our country's now split in half. We've had to fight this terrible civil war and this war for independence stuff. What was it all for? Like, and then also as well, like in 1937, they ended up eventually having an Irish Republic anyway. And then in, I believe, 1949, they ended up leaving the Commonwealth. So Ireland ended up being independent anyway, right? So it was just, but it took a long, long time. And it was like, what was all that fighting for, right? It was just, there's no benefit to this. And also, just to give an idea of just how tied Ireland was to the UK, right? So first of all, Ireland only joined the EEC because Britain joined, right? So in 1973, because of this heavy reliance on trade with the UK, Ireland made its decision on whether it was going to join or whether it was not going to join based on what Britain was going to do. So if Britain joined the EEC, Ireland was going to join. If Britain was not going to join the EEC, Ireland was not going to join, right? Because it wouldn't have made sense for Britain to have joined and for Ireland to have stayed out, or for Britain to have stayed out and for Ireland to have joined, yeah, because they're so tied economically that it would have hurt Ireland either way. And on top of that, up until 1978, Ireland's currency was controlled directly by the Bank of England. Now, they didn't say it in those kind of ways, but in reality, the Irish pound, or the punt, it had a one-to-one exchange rate with the British pound, which meant that if the British pound went up, then the Irish pound went up. If it went down, it went down. So up until 1978, Ireland had no control over its own currency. That's how tied it was to Britain, right? However, fast forward for all these years, and we can see that Ireland didn't just become richer than Britain, but today it's even richer than the United States here when it comes to GDP per capita. And this is partly because, small nations, if you look at the rankings here for best standard of living, the highest GDP per capita, etc., nearly all kind of things you can look at, right? Small countries of less than 10 million people tend to dominate those leaderboards, right? So there's a big argument, that actually it's better, it's more accountable, it's more democratic, it's more, standard of living's a better everything, right? In smaller countries. So for instance, when we look at Scotland, people kind of go, oh, Scotland shouldn't be independent, Wales shouldn't be independent. Well, maybe if you look at it just right now, but in the long run, it does make sense, because they'll probably govern themselves in a better way than as it currently is. And similarly, I think that England should also be independent from the UK, but that's a separate conversation for another time. So people still make the argument, that Britain should have stayed within the EU, when in all cases, Ireland and America were far more integrated within the British system than we ever were within the European system, right? And never mind the fact that, in terms of languages, we have a shared language. The EU is pretty much just the Tower of Babel, It's got 23 official languages, right? So there's no common kinship, there's no over-reliance on trade. Most of Britain's trade is done outside of the bloc, only 43% of it is done with the EU. So what's the real argument, right? And this is what we're going to kind of look into for the rest of this video. To turn a Bill Clinton quote on its head, right? It's not the economy, it's values, stupid. So this is actually what people vote on when it comes to elections, right? And for something as important as, independence, it's about values, right? So what are the kind of competing values? This is something which you never really hear, People kind of say, oh, it's to do with globalization versus nationalism, etc., etc. Not really. When it really boils down to it, one side is in favor of independence, right? And the other side is in favor of cooperation. Now, obviously, there's a little bit of overlap, and obviously, as with all things, simple narratives, avoid complexity. So there's probably problems within that. But, as Thomas Sowell said, there's no solutions, there's only trade-offs. So the problem is that those people who value independence, like myself, right? For instance, if you're in a group project in school, you might be put in a group which is really, really good. Everyone's all switched on and stuff. You get on with the people there. They're all hard workers. Everyone pulls the weight, right? And more could be achieved with that group than just you as one person. On the flip side, if you end up being in a group with people you don't really like, you didn't want to be in that group in the first place, and that people just leave you to do all the work yourself, it might just have been a better thing and way less stressful and just better in general had you worked as an individual on that project, right? So this is the kind of thing, yeah, right? So Sinn Féin, yeah, as far as I'm aware, my Irish is not obviously, it's almost non-existent. But as far as I'm aware, Sinn Féin means ourselves alone, right? And Britain doing Brexit is essentially having that attitude, yeah, that yes, obviously Europe can govern itself in whichever way it wants. That's fine. If Ireland wants to be in the EU, if France, if Germany, etc., that's fine. But we kind of just want to do our own thing, yeah. We want to govern ourselves, and that's just that, right? And actually, if you look at the case for for Britain leaving and stuff, I'm not going to rehash all the arguments about Brexit because like it's done, and also Brexit has it is reality, so there's no point in kind of whinging about it and stuff, right? But if you look at in terms of representation, right? So as we kind of made the point before about Ireland having 15% of its MPs in the British Parliament. In 1979, Britain had about 20% of like the total MEPs in the European Parliament, right? And also something to note is that in 1975, when we had the referendum, people said, no, 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 there won't be a European Parliament. That's all just fear-mongering and stuff. Yeah, like kind of like, that's just people trying to scare you and stuff. It's just trade, people. It's just trade. It's just trade. Yeah. And then, as soon as the vote happened, yeah, by the way, yeah, we were always going to have a Parliament. What are you talking about? Like, it was in the treaties, right? So, yeah, very kind of sneaky moves and stuff, yeah. And also people, again, time and time again, if you read the actual founding document of the EU and actually read like what the founders were wanting, they wanted the United States of Europe. And the thing is, that's fine. If you want the United States of Europe, there's a strong argument for that and stuff, right? But the thing is, it's like, again, this thing of, do you want to cooperate with people? Like, is cooperating with your neighbours like more important? Yeah, like kind of like, to stop war, to stop like kind of all these kind of things, to work together and like, is it better to kind of do that, or is it better to just kind of go about it like yourself, right? So over time, this is kind of what ended up happening with the EU, yeah, right, when it comes to Britain's representation, right? So in 1979, it went from 20%, then in 1994, it went down to 15%, then in 1999, it went down to 14%, and then in 2019, which is the last year that we were in there for, right, we had just 9.7% of seats in the European Parliament, right? So this means that like our influence over time is being reduced, right? And this is obviously because like new members joining, etc., like the EU expanding and stuff, right? So back when it was just 9 members, like we had a lot of say, and then obviously when it became 28 members, we didn't have as much say as we had before, right? But the thing is, it's like this is the kind of debate that you see a lot with like the founding fathers, right? So recently I've read the Federalist Papers and the Anti-Federalist Papers, right? So the Federalists obviously arguing, people like James Madison, John Jay, and Alexander Hamilton, right? They were arguing for a United States of America. They were arguing for a constitution which had a strong government, a strong the president, and federal government, right? Whereas the Anti-Federalists, what they wanted was basically kind of a maintenance of what they already had with the Articles of Confederation, where each of the individual states basically have sovereignty and they kind of govern themselves, like for apart from when it comes to like common defense, and then even that like is a lot of that's to do with like what the individual states want and stuff, right? So the debate between Brexit and staying in the EU is kind of similar to that same debate about like the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists, right? Because those who want the United States of Europe, there's a strong case for that. And then also at the same time, those who want national sovereignty, there's also a strong case for that as well. It's just to do with competing values, yeah, and there's trade-offs with whichever one you have, yeah. If you have United States of Europe, there's going to be trade-offs, yeah. Like, the ordinary citizens within the EU are going to be, less, the government is going to be less accountable to them, yeah, right? For me, living in London, Parliament is just down the road. It's one bus ride away, right? But it may as well be in Australia for me because it's like the Parliament doesn't like really listen to what the people like want, yeah, right? It doesn't really serve the nation as it is. So why would I want a foreign Parliament hundreds of miles away, yeah, right, in a foreign country with made up of people from all different countries, yeah, most of which like don't speak English and stuff, right? The government we already have is bad enough. Why would we want another government on top of that? But then obviously some people might say, but like it's, the government, it's better to have a larger government, like kind of, and because then it's stronger, we can work more together, and like, all the kind of commonalities and stuff, and we'll be stronger up against the America and against China and Russia, etc., etc. So the thing is that there's arguments for that and there's arguments against that, but Britain, as we've said in previous videos, is uniquely placed in terms of if it wanted to opt out of that, it had the best stance for opting out of it. And the reason why Britain also had so many opt-outs when it came to the euro and Schengen and all these other things, is because much in the same way as the American colonies were the golden goose of the British Empire, right? Britain was the golden goose of the EU. So although we end up having all these rebates and all these kind of benefits and stuff, right? We were still the second largest contributor after Germany to the EU budget, and we got very, very little in return. And so they were able to offer us all these generous deals and stuff, right? Because they knew that actually we would put in far more into it than like we would ever get back in return, right? The common fishery policy, the common agricultural policy, all these things here do not benefit Britain. Now, I'll concede that there's an argument for staying in the single market because, the single market, you could argue, has some like free market benefits and stuff. But then also there's the trade-off of, it allows freedom of movement, which then conflicts with what we said at the beginning, with people wanting to have more control of who comes and who goes. So it's like, you can make an argument for Britain being in the single market. Yeah, I'll concede that. That's fair enough. But I don't think there's much an argument for staying in for like rejoining the EU, because if we rejoin, it's going to be on worse terms. They're not going to give us all these concessions that they had before and stuff. Because the newer nations are going to be like, well, why we didn't like the fact that these guys had all these concessions in the first place. We want to have some of these concessions, but we weren't allowed to. So we're going to have to probably join the euro. We're going to have to join this, that, etc., etc. So as a result, public opinion nowadays is saying, actually, as much as people grumble, as much as people might say that they regret Brexit and if they could go back again, they wouldn't have. It's a thing where if you ask people, do you want to actively rejoin the EU? There's actually a very small percentage of them who actually want to, right? So that's kind of something to bear in mind. But the thing is, we're 5 years into Brexit, right? We spent 3.5 years of that debating whether it actually happened at all. So you can't really blame business in a way for like being, well, you can in a way because you had like plenty of time to plan for this and stuff. Yeah. But at the same time, it's like if that time had been spent like focusing on these kind of problems, there's going to be shortages of labourers, there's going to be this, et cetera, etc. If they'd focused more on that, then many of these problems which we're seeing now would have been smoothed over and stuff, right? And also something to bear in mind is that, Jacob Rees-Mogg, he said this a while ago. He said and he got a lot of stick for this. He said, Brexit is like, we'll see the benefits of Brexit in 50 years' time. And people kind of laughed at that and stuff, right? But as you can see with the economic data we have here when it came to Irish independence and with American independence, 50 years later, we might still, it might take that long just to see any kind of benefits from this. And bear in mind, we didn't have to fight a civil war for this. We didn't have to fight a war for independence. Most of our trade is with outside the EU. All we're doing is leaving a trading bloc, and leaving a kind of parliament, etc., etc. That's all we're kind of doing. So it's not that deep and stuff, right? And we were never going to put tariffs on the EU. If anything, they would have put tariffs on us, which would have been minuscule in comparison to historic standards, And on top of that, that would have just increased the amount of trade we did with outside the EU anyway. So how is Brexit going to be it's not the end of the world. Yes, it might, there'll be bumps and stuff. Yes, there will be problems down the line and stuff. But the thing is, it's not going to be a clear cut thing. Yes, of course, there's going to be complications. Yes, of course, there'll be some shortages, etc., etc. But in the long term, I think 50 years from now, we're going to look back at this and be like, this was a smart decision to make. And I think to use the quote from Thomas Paine, when he said, a continent shouldn't be governed by an island. I also think that an island shouldn't be governed by a continent, right? Japan is not going to be governed by China, right? In the same way that China oughtn't to be governed by Japan. Each country has its own unique history, has its own unique geography and stuff, right? And that ought to be respected, and it should be allowed, right? Whichever path people want to take, that should be what people do, right? And also to talk about China, so there was I forget who exactly it was, but some high up Chinese person, in I believe the 1970s, 1980s, was asked for their opinion on the French Revolution, and what he said was, it's too early to say. and that was 200 years or so after the French Revolution happened. But it gives you an idea of, you can't tell whether something in history was necessarily a good thing or necessarily a bad thing until a long time has passed. And for us to have only been 5 years into this process, with most of the process only happening in the last 2 years, it's far too early to say whether Brexit is to blame for all of our ills or whether it will be the saviour of this country. And so with all of that being said, I hope that you really enjoyed that video, and don't forget to hit the like button. As you can see, I'm wearing my merch. Yeah, so we've got this. I remember last time I was a bit too, didn't show the thing off properly, but this is a nice shirt. You can see the picture of it now. And yeah, obviously check us out on Instagram as well. I think around Christmas time, I'm gonna like really focus on like the sale of these things. So worked out the prices for them and everything as well. So we've got obviously, we've got notebook as well. Got that, it's very, very nice, as you can see, and it's got obviously the writing there. We've got a pen as well, pen, and also as well we've got key rings and everything as well. So yeah, so definitely, you know, check us out and stuff. Yeah, like we're not going anywhere. I think around probably around Christmas time, yeah, we're going to be doing film reviews. So I know I've been talking about it for a long, long time. We do still have a few more alternative history scenarios to kind of look at and stuff. This video I kind of did more just because this has really been bugging me for a while. But yeah, anyway, so with that being said, I hope you really enjoyed this video, and also let me know in the comment section what I've missed out. Like, I mean, inevitably there will be people who will be whinging in the comments and section and stuff, yeah. But it's good to still hear people's perspective, because obviously we've all got different values, we've all got different ways of looking at things, and that's what the debate is, yeah. That's why we live in democracy. However, living in democracy means we have to be respectful. So be respectful in the comment section, because otherwise, me will block you. Hey. Or probably more likely not, just end up arguing with you for like days and days, which is kind of sad. But anyway, in the meantime, have a great day and bye.